Welcome to the Criminologist podcast. Our goal here is to educate and enlighten our listeners, focusing on the latest and greatest evidence-based interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. And not only those factors which drive folks into crime, we also look at the reasons why people exit a life of crime. Also, we attempt to paint an accurate picture of that journey from the perspective of the justice-involved individual. Too often, our perceptions of those involved in the system are tainted by media-driven caricatures created to sell newspapers or movie tickets. This adds little to a healthy dialogue as to how to best address criminality. This podcast will avoid stereotypes and biases. We will endeavor to accomplish the first two goals in a way that keep you, the listener, interested and even entertained. And now, the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 27 of the Criminologist podcast. Glad to have you with us. I am once again taking a break from supervising our clientele, which we have been sharing with you all, to bring you yet another subject matter expert in the field. This week, very excited to be joined by Jane Mulcahy, joining us all the way from Ireland. Jane Mulcahy is currently working at the University of Limerick as a research fellow. The PhD research she conducted was entitled Connected Connections and Corrected Connections, Post-Release Supervision of Sentenced Male Prisoners. She's been writing for the past 20 years on a variety of topics. She's worked with the Cork Alliance Centre and the Irish Penal Reform Trust, the University College Dublin, and the Law Reform Commission of Ireland. I am absolutely thrilled to be able to share my conversation with her for you all. Please enjoy my chat with Jane Mulcahy, joining us from Ireland. Well, hello, Jane. I'm thrilled that you're joining us all the way over in Ireland. Why don't we start off by you telling us a little bit about yourself and, generally speaking, a little bit about your current work.
Sure, Joe. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for the invitation. So I've worked as a researcher mainly in criminal justice and human rights, penal reform type issues for about 16 years now. I'm a wife and a mom, and I just recently started a new job at the University of Limerick as a research fellow on a really exciting youth justice project. It's called the REP project, so it's about putting research evidence into policy programs and practice, and it's kind of an exciting collaboration between the University of Limerick and the Department of Justice. It was the Department of Children and Youth Affairs, but it's now been moved back to the Department of Justice. And for the last about 15 years, I've been exploring, I suppose, the intersections between poverty, deprivation, but also more recently, kind of difficulties in children's early years, stressors in their environment, in the home and in the wider community. And I'm excited now with the University of Limerick to be putting that information more into trying to identify practical solutions.
Yeah, and I love that approach from research to practice. Something we all can do.
Yeah, well, I think as an impact-oriented person, I suppose, and also, again, as a parent with young children, I kind of think, what's the point in just theorizing about things if we don't actually want to maybe implement positive change on the ground? So for me, I've found, having worked in a variety of different types of research role, the ones where it is more impact-oriented and has the potential to lead to positive change are the type of projects that I find personally more satisfying. So I am excited to be starting this work that I'm now embarking upon.
Yeah, and I could not agree with you more. I've read some of your stuff. Let's do a deeper dive at a paper you wrote entitled Daring to Ask What Happened to You, Why Correctional Systems Must Become trauma responsive. Before we get into that paper, though, for our listeners who are not up to speed on ACES, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experience, can you kind of give us a crash course, Jane, on the history of ACES and what that's all about, kind of just in broad strokes?
Sure. Well, the first Adverse Childhood Experiences study was done in the late 90s. It was published in 1998, and it was a collaboration between the Center for Disease Control in America and Kaiser Permanente, which you may know is a big insurance provider in the States.
Mm-hmm.
And so it explored these 10 common childhood adversities drawn from the existing epidemiological evidence at the time. And the study involved mainly white, mainly middle-class, college-educated people who could afford pricey health insurance. And what they found is that childhood adversities are very common. So over 60% of the 17,000 people who did the study had at least one childhood adversity, and around 12% had 4 or more. And these adversities were things like abuse or neglect, so physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, emotional neglect, or living with someone in the home who had a mental illness, or who was drug addicted, or had an alcohol dependency, or living with someone who was incarcerated. And even among these very privileged sample, they found that childhood adversities were common. But the dose response was very important in terms of health and social outcomes. So the more adversities that a person accumulated, so if they had 4 or more, their risk of developing heart disease was doubled. Their risk of developing alcohol abuse was 7 times what it would be if you had no childhood adversities. And the attempted suicide risk was 12 times that of people who had no childhood adversities. And they've done subsequent studies where they found that, these things are, again, very common. They don't discriminate in terms of education level or geographical location. But the more recent studies have found that certain ethnic groups have more adversities, and this is due to things like systemic racism and inequality, and that women also are more likely to have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. There have been a few studies in the kind of criminal context and the juvenile justice context, and again, the more adversities that someone has in their childhood, the more likely that they'll have addictive behaviors. There's links with interpersonal violence, being a victim of violence and being a perpetrator of violence, and at a range of mental health issues. So these are public health matters. And Bessel van der Kolk, a psychiatrist, says frankly that adverse childhood experiences are the biggest public health threat of our time. Now, obviously, he said that before COVID-19, but they're the biggest kind of persistent, ongoing public health issue across the world. I would say it's not just an American issue. Every country has similar problems in this regard, and we are neglecting them.
As you rattle those off, I was thinking in my head, those are certainly variables that criminal justice practitioners come across with their clientele. And you, in fact, note that because justice-involved individuals are coming from communities in which they're surrounded by these ACEs, these adverse childhood experiences, that the criminal justice practitioner really needs to be aware of that to better understand their clients and then to better assist them. So maybe speak to our listeners about that, of how a lot of times we're working in this absence of they're not even cognizant of these ACEs, and to what degree does that hamper their ability to deliver services?
Well, a friend of mine, Ian Smith, I met him actually through the kind of ACE Aware Nation movement in Scotland. He is a successful criminal defense lawyer, and he only stumbled upon this ACEs science a couple of years ago, but it has transformed his thinking and his practice. And it's because he kind of always knew it. I mean, it's very hard to work in a field and not know that people are wounded, but you don't quite get what it does to the developing brain and body until you're presented with the science, until you do a bit of research, and you kind of realize that actually in many ways, we're all the same. We need the same things to flourish and be healthy. And if we're denied them in our development, if we're exposed to the pernicious harm of racism, if we grow up in a home that's chronically stressed because of poverty, if our parent is self-medicating because of their own unprocessed trauma, how in God's name are we meant to concentrate in a classroom and behave ourselves well and learn and be able to make or sustain healthy relationships with our peers? And then we also develop a lack of trust in humanity because of the lack of safety in our formative years, so that we go out into the world expecting humans to be brutal and vicious and demeaning. And the criminal justice system, particularly in the States, is quite traumatic and re-traumatizing. It's also that in Ireland, but maybe not quite to the same degree. But by not understanding what an accumulation of risk factors, in the language of risk assessment, does actually to our neuroendocrine system, to our stress response system, how it impairs our ability actually to access our cortical thinking brain, then we as practitioners are not going to engage with people really in a kind of helpful way. We might actually make things worse for them. Or if we're criminal defense lawyers, we're just not making the most compassionate case for someone to a judge. And judges, of course, as well, don't have this information and might be more punitive minded. Or we judge people, I suppose, from our own experiences often. And if we haven't experienced a lot of adversity, well, we're in the comfortable place of not being able to imagine what we might be like under different circumstances. And from having learned about all of this, I actually quite marvel some of the time at people's capacity to keep on going, even if it means that they use drugs and alcohol to survive, because that's why they're doing it. It is literally to survive with the pain and the lack of safety in their bodies around other people.
You just now mentioned risk assessment. And in fact, in that same paper, you note the work of Bonta and Andrews and their book, The Psychology of Criminal Conduct, of which I have a copy right here on my desk. But you also note that the Risk-Need-Responsivity's focus on criminogenic variables should be reinterpreted in light of what is being revealed via the science around, again, that lifelong impact of childhood trauma. Listeners of the show know that we supervise a caseload of fictitious felons, but I view our interventions through not just the lens of the risk-needs-responsivity model, but also the emerging desistance models and, of course, trauma. My mantra is that I think we really need to come at justice-involved individuals with a much, much more holistic approach, which takes into account everything we're talking about here. So what would you say to those practitioners that are anchored exclusively in the risk-needs-responsivity model?
Well, I mean, it's important to acknowledge that that model is very important. And as Shad Maruna and I think it was Ward said, it kind of helped save rehabilitation as an ideal at a time that it was falling out of favor, and people, particularly in the States, were becoming more punitive, and it was about warehousing dangerous people. So the R&R definitely has a value. Where I think it's limited is in the fact that it is completely trauma blind. It doesn't look at context, and this is a major criticism from desistance theorists, is that it is blind also to structural violence, really, and what that can do to people and communities in forms of relentless stressors. And so the thing as well about understanding the basics of brain development is that the R&R reliance on manualized kind of programs that are based around cognitive behavioral therapy will not work with people who are continuously in survival mode.
Right.
And that is because if I have spent my whole life just fighting to survive, then I have certain parts of my brain are overactivated. So my amygdala, the fear center, will be overactive. My survival brain, the brainstem, it will be shooting off all these messages that I'm in danger even when I'm not, actually, from an objective level. And emotionally, I'll be more unstable because I don't maybe even know quite what I'm feeling or why I'm feeling it. And if I encounter danger or threat, for example, when I'm released from prison and I've nowhere to go, or I'm going back to my old community where I know that I'm going to be pulled into, relationships with antisocial peers, or, the only way I can make money is maybe by dealing drugs again. Well, telling me that this is something to do with my faulty, warped core beliefs, or, that I have antisocial attitudes per se, is kind of missing the fact that as humans, as mammals, we're primed to survive. And that when we're fearful, the rational part of our brain goes offline, is inaccessible to us. And if we don't understand bottom-up hijacking, which is basically where our survival impulses derail that part of our brain, the thinking brain that is amenable to CBT, then we're just missing the point, actually. And so a lot of what I've argued in a more recent paper in this current edition of Advancing Corrections about a neurodevelopmentally aware and trauma responsive understanding of risk is that a lot of what we might label as antisocial, behavior, or even an antisocial personality disorder, is actually, if you understand interpersonal neurobiology, the people are living in a chronic state of defense. They are battling to survive. And sometimes violence even is kind of an adaptive behavior when you live in a very unsafe, violent world. And so that is my kind of beef with the RNR, is it doesn't get survival responses.
Right.
It pathologizes the individual rather than trying to work with the fact that we all need to feel safe in our bodies around other people in order to be able to relate to one another, in order to have empathy, in order to be able to think about consequences.
Well, you'll be happy to know, Jane, that in addition to having a copy of The Psychology of Criminal Conduct here on my desk, I also have copies of Offending and Desistance by Beth Weaver, Making Good by Shad Maruda, and Pervasive Punishment by Fergus McNeil. So I've gone down that rabbit hole. And again, for anyone who's new to the show, because they maybe just tuned in to listen to Jane today, when I, again, conduct those interventions rather with our mock caseload, it's part of the R&R model as far as, why people enter into a life of crime. And sometimes those cognitive behavioral interventions play a role. But I also dabble with some of the emerging desistance models, and we look at stuff like people's identity and we get into primary, secondary, and tertiary desistance. So again, I'm really trying to take a holistic approach up to including everything we're hearing today, viewing that person's journey through the trauma lens as well.
Excellent.
So that's fantastic. Let's change gears just a little bit here, and let's touch on the fact that criminal justice professionals, particularly those working, in a jail or a prison facility, are likely to experience secondary trauma without even being aware of it.
Yeah, that's a big issue. I mean, you see it very clearly. I think I'm rewatching The Wire at the moment, and just the police have high levels of abusing alcohol, really. Having inappropriate extramarital affairs. A lot of the behaviors that we'd condemn in offenders are actually being replicated in the people who are policing them. And also in prison staff and among perhaps probation or parole, or even lawyers sometimes, people who are being exposed to very difficult details about, human brutality, really, to one another, and systemic brutality. It's very hard for that not to get under the skin of people. And this is actually how we should understand trauma in general, is that it's an embodied experience. It gets into our skin, into our bones, into our blood, into our organs, and changes us. And the things that kind of help mitigate against trauma are healthy relationships. And so, for example, if we were trying to change the system, we need to start with the people working in it, get them awareness around trauma and what it does to individuals and communities, and how it impacts our ability to behave well, because some of the brutality that then is doled out in the system is also because of trauma, because we actually live in a trauma organized world. So people might be going into work as policemen or women or prison officers with their own trauma to begin with, and then they're working in an environment that is quite brutalizing. And that is not a healthy environment to be working in. So if we start prioritizing a felt sense of safety, if we try and make prisons, let's say, or young offenders institutions, if we try and make them feel safe for everyone, there will be improvements in health, in staff retention. There'll be less violent incidences, less suicidal behavior on the part of prisoners, but also less suicidal behavior on the part of staff, because these are difficult environments to work in, and if a system wants to become trauma informed or responsive, it has got to support staff. It has got to try and be attuned to their needs and to listen to them. And often our systems don't really listen to the people at the front lines.
You mentioned earlier one of the things that can be done to mitigate the effects of that trauma is to foster healthy relationships. And obviously this is an extremely complex issue, but are there any things that if someone's listening and they're, progressively minded and they want to sort of embrace this new approach, you mentioned fostering relationships, any other, again, sort of broad strokes things or things that the practitioner can keep in mind that they can seek out or get resources around, or,
Yeah, sure. Well, what we know is, and again, this is not just in the criminal justice context, but it kind of comes from our human beingness, really, is that we can only actually survive and thrive in the context of relationships. And many great criminal justice professionals, including lawyers with no trauma training or prison officers with no trauma training, do this anyway. And it's an instinctive thing. And it's just being kind and compassionate and listening. Listening is a very therapeutic activity. And the problem with risk assessment tools is we listen, but we listen selectively, and we don't listen to the things that are not relevant to the risk assessment tool. And then what we're saying to people, if they're trying to tell us about trauma, is that's not relevant to me. I don't want to hear this. And if we can just be a witness, Gabor Mate, who's one of my absolute favorites, he says, trauma is not what happens to us, but what we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. And so what I would say is good prison officers, good parole officers are people who can listen and bear witness. And when they're told difficult details, that they simply listen and believe it and validate the person, and then also give them hope for a positive future, because just by listening to someone, we can change their neural state. So if someone is agitated or activated, if I listen to you and you're upset and you're worried, if I listen, really and truly listen and see and hear you, that will have a positive impact on your nervous system. And so really, we are all our own best tool. I interviewed a probation officer for my PhD research, and he said that we are our own best tool. So it's not the risk assessment instrument, it's our relationship with the person who's in front of us. But that means really listening to them, being present. And unfortunately, the system that is about case management, and getting churning through numbers, isn't always conducive to that. But many prisoners have also told me that they've had really good relationships with prison officers, and those were just kind people who would listen to them and actually just show respect for people, and also give them a bit of hope that, they have talents, they have abilities. This is the strengths-based aspect of desistance theory that I really like, and the relationship-based practice. We can do a lot to actually be a one good adult for even, men of 45 or 50 who've been in the system their whole lives. And I just recommend people to watch this video by Fritzi Horstman and the Compassion Prison Project. It's called Step Inside the Circle. It's about a group of male prisoners in California who are part of this restorative justice circle, and the ACES science is brought to them, and it's really phenomenally empowering and interesting, where they kind of all of a sudden realize it's not just them. The adversity in their lives has helped make them be the way they are, and that there is hope for the future. But really, healing takes place in the context of relationships. And no matter what our role, we can be an important person for someone just by listening and being kind and compassionate. And I suppose seeing them behind their bad behaviors, if you get me.
100%. Yeah. Before I forget, what I can do is I will track down, or you can send me the link to that Step Inside the Circle video. Yeah. And then what I will do, listeners, is I'll include that in the episode description of the podcast you're listening to. So the link will be right in the description of this episode. I want to get into desistance in a bit, since it's my passion. But just to put a bow on the R&R stuff, yeah, you're right. With the trauma, at best, it factors into, it's considered a responsivity consideration. It's considered, a barrier to getting at those criminogenic variables. But as you've just so eloquently laid out, it's so much more than that. And I think sometimes it even gets, dare I say, partisan, that the hardcore, and I was formerly one of them before I discovered the wonderful world of desistance, the hardcore risk-needs-responsivity disciples, almost shun or whatever the adverb I'm looking for is here, trauma, because it's non-criminogenic. Therefore, we're going to focus on the central 8, the big drivers. But again, they kind of miss the forest from the trees when they're taking that, looking at the change process through such a narrow lens. So you mentioned desistance. Let's go there, but go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say there was an article not that long ago by Cheng and Wormuth. There might have been Wormuth, another person as well, where they were trying to argue that executive function covers the kind of responsivity angle. But the thing with executive function, again, is that's the cortical thinking brain. And many problems that people have with high levels of adversity and embodied trauma is that it's the lower regions of their brain that are causing the problems. They are bringing the capacity to reason, the ability to control impulses, the memory, a language use even. These things go offline when we're frightened. And so it's the R&R and desistance theory, I would say, have to get to grips with the fact that our bodies need to feel safe in the presence of other bodies. And if they don't, all bets are off in terms of our cortical functioning.
Right.
But anyway, go ahead and ask me some questions on desistance.
Well, our paths crossed, I believe, through Fergus McNeil and or Shad Maruna. It was an email chain going on. And, Fergus McNeil and desistance are often mentioned in the same sentence. we've been talking about trauma. Again, let's kind of switch gears and go to Desistance, and tell us your thoughts and experience with Desistance, and or how that factors into what we've been talking about as far as the relevance of trauma considerations.
Sure. Well, when I started my PhD research, desistance theory was really uppermost in my mind. And I was placed for the 4 years of my PhD with an employment partner as part of my funding arrangement. So I was funded through the Probation Service and the Irish Research Council. And this group called the Cork Alliance Centre, which is a desistance project in Cork City, was my employment partner. So that works very much to a strengths-based desistance model. And both Shad Maruna and Fergus McNeill would be kind of big gurus, and they have a very, again, humane, and I suppose the attraction of desistance is that it again shines a light on the ecological context and the need for opportunities for people, and also the role of agency and self-identity in the change process. And Fergus was actually my external examiner for my PhD and gave me a fine grilling. It was excellent. And I chose him because as a writer, like, he's a beautiful writer and a wonderful speaker and a really engaging person. But also he prioritizes relationship, and he would say that the kind of risk management discourse shifted the focus in probation away from the one-to-one relationship, which I think he felt was really important in facilitating positive change or working with someone. And then risk management shifted it towards manualized group work programs and referring out to external services. And that kind of happened in Ireland a bit as well, as part of professionalizing probation. But I suppose for my own research, some of the limitations of desistance really were that, it didn't focus on maybe giving a very compelling account of why people who want to change and dearly want to change have these condemnation scripts. They feel bound up in these circumstances that they can't escape from. And my interviewees, the older ones, like 6 out of the 12 were over 30, and they were all kind of in that web of wanting to change, really hoping they could change, but being quite fearful that they couldn't. And addictions were a big part of that. But also, it was within a couple of minutes of just talking to the prisoners, the men, that I could see, oh my God, they've lived through such horrendous lives. That's just from just telling me a few small details. And I was saying the literature does not properly engage with this. And so I think desistance theory would also benefit from kind of looking at what do we do with people that improves their sense of safety in the world, because people have these identities. But for example, my interviewees, they didn't really have all that much of I don't think, a spoilt identity because of just being a criminal. It was more the fact that they were in addiction most of their lives. Or also, the spoilt identity for many began in childhood through neglect and lack of opportunity. And many people just didn't even know really who they were, because there's such a complex interplay of all these symptoms and behaviors, and they sometimes mistook themselves for these symptoms and behaviors, whereas trauma theory and practice tells us you are not your symptoms and behaviors. Those are adaptive behaviors to get through unspeakable things. Mm-hmm. And but what I love about desistance is the focus on strengths. And people, no matter what they've done, have strengths in their lives. They have talents, and we don't ask people enough what those talents are, what the interests are, what do they need. I mean, I think if we began with that question, what's important to you? What are you interested in? What do you need to change? Then we're making it about them rather than about making them less risky for the rest of us. And there has to be something in it for people. And the other thing that is appealing, I suppose, about Desistance is our role as a society in helping people be redeemed. Because what's the point in redeeming yourself if no one believes you've changed and no one will give you opportunities to play a positive role? And so I actually think desistance theory and trauma theory and practice have a lot in common, and can be more comfortably married than trauma theory and the R&R, for example. There's just too much of a gap between them. And yet, I do think there are benefits to the R&R in the sense that there is a framework for people and it can guide practice, but very often it becomes just an unthinking kind of box ticking exercise that I think is a bit blaming and shaming rather than seeking to truly understand behavior.
Yeah, the box checking is a big thing. Even though this is being recorded, Jane, I catch myself here scribbling down nuggets of what you've said. And when you said earlier, I forget the context, but, working with someone, I wrote down on my Post-it note here, working with someone versus on someone. That's what we do in the Risk-Need-Responsivity model. We work on somebody to fix them.
Yes. And you see, people need to realize that they're not broken in order to have hope. And that is, for me, actually what ACES science can help people understand. When they see that these, at a population level, that these adversities have a cumulative impact, and then they can see themselves and their problems in the light of all these other people, then it's not just them anymore, if you get me. It's kind of a thing of, I am not just the broken one. These things impact all of us, especially when we don't have emotionally stable adults to help us process things as children. And the thing to return to relationships is we all need people over our life course. And if we don't have emotionally stable adults, in our family or wider community, then frankly, helping professionals can provide that role. And even, a teacher in a prison or a kindly probation officer or even a decent lawyer. For example, a man I did a course with who had a history of addiction and criminality told me he had this lawyer who, as a young boy, really fought for him. And that made a difference to him as an adult, that he even had this memory of someone who felt he was worth fighting for. So even if it's a small interaction with someone, we mustn't underestimate either the healing or the harmful effect that our behavior and our responses to someone can have. So I don't know if that makes sense, but it's something that I've really experienced myself in giving talks, that I can have a positive or a negative impact on someone. And one of the other things that I love about desistance theory is the whole idea of normal Smiths and kind of restoring past experience and past behavior. And I think trauma helps us do that as well, or trauma theory, that it gives us another way of saying, well, your behaviors were harmful and breach the rights of other people. But they actually are kind of understandable under the circumstances. Deviant behavior is normal if you have an overdose of stressors and trauma in your life. All the accumulated evidence is now telling us this, even though some people might disagree. But it is the accumulation of stressors in people's lives in the absence of healthy relationships that is devastating. And so desistance theory, with its emphasis on relationships and strengths, should tell us those are the things we need to prioritize, is forming healthy relationships. And I suppose the R&R tells us that too, that we need to have more relationships with pro-social peers. But how do you get them?
Well, and it's not so much about, you're right, pro-social peers, but I don't think it broaches it doesn't get at what you referred to earlier as this sort of binary approach, this wall between the practitioner and the client, which you'll be happy to know, Jane, that the tagline for my show, I end every episode by reminding our listeners, there's no them, there's only us.
Yes, absolutely. Beautiful.
Let's talk about your podcast, Law and Justice. What can listeners expect on Law and Justice?
Well, Law and Justice, as the name suggests, covers a lot of issues related to law and justice, but kind of everything in between as well. I've covered matters to do with reproductive health, ACES, science, trauma, stuff around addiction, homelessness. Really, I'm just very curious, and I do believe that everything is connected. So I started a YouTube series at the start of lockdown. It was kind of, I gave myself a new project and I decided to record a special series of Law and Justice, which is on SoundCloud. That's my only platform at the moment because I'm a bit lazy and too busy to be sourcing other ones. But on the YouTube channel, it's called How to Talk Policy and Influence People. And I suppose the point of it was to try and help people see that they have a role to play in policy formation, that they have voices and they've experienced, whether it is through lived expertise of homelessness and addiction and mental health problems, or whether they are actual policymakers, or whether they're teachers, who are teaching little kids who are dealing with really difficult things. And it's an achievement to even turn up in the classroom in the morning, if they're living in homeless accommodation with inadequate food and that type of thing. And I just wanted to join the dots for people, I suppose, or help them see that housing policy and racism and chronic stress on parents have an impact on children, and children's experience have an impact on their ability to flourish over the life course, but then also to have hopeful messages that it's never too late, because I interviewed some people who've been through very difficult experiences, but have come out the other side and now are real beacons, of powerful advocacy and are helping to heal other people, such as Mick Finnegan and James Leonard and Cissy White. They're all available. And I just kind of would like to motivate people to get more involved, I suppose, in the policymaking process, either by emailing, their elected officials in the States or in Ireland. And, if they're working in academia, to make their information digestible and usable by people who are making decisions, because we can't blame them for not reading our work if we don't send it to them, well, maybe we can, but I believe in making it easy for people to use our information. So that's it, really. There's a range of matters. There's kind of something for everyone in the audience, I think, on the channel, and some things then are more light as well. Occasionally I will do something more on the arts, but again, I think the arts is connected to healing from trauma and preventing trauma. The arts are also very relevant to people in prison and can be some of the ways in which they foster a new sense of personal identity. They might discover they're really good at drama or really good at painting, and it helps them see themselves differently. So everything is connected.
I did check out your YouTube channel. I think it was an episode that you referenced on your LinkedIn page, Jane. But what I'll do, so I have a YouTube channel as well entitled The Criminologist, and kind of as you just noted, it's about, joining the dots and bringing folks together. I say on the page that I sort of consider myself a maven as far as some of the content on my channel is mine. I do a series on Desistance, but then I've also got videos by Shad Maruna, Fergus McNeil, Dr. Guy Bergone. What I'll do, Jane, and I can talk with you offline about this, is if there's videos which are more germane to what you and I have been talking about, I'll go ahead and I've got various playlists set up, so I can set up a playlist and then can again kind of link your content. So if people are on my channel, they can see your channel as well.
That would be very kind.
And again, we're kindred spirits because when you just said, making things more digestible, that's really the approach that I take both with this podcast and with my YouTube channel. I don't mind sitting down with a cup of coffee and reading someone's PhD dissertation, but I know that's not everybody's cup of tea. Excuse the pun. So I try to just kind of break that down, and I bristle when people say dumb it down. I can't stand that term, but I just sort of make it more digestible.
Yeah.
Which again sounds kind of like what you're doing. So yeah, in that regard, I think we're two peas in a pod.
I think so.
Jane, this has been fantastic. I hope you'll come back. And like I said, I will leave links to the video that you referenced. The Step Inside the Circle will be in the episode of this podcast. And again, if you're already subscribing to my channel, listener, I'll set up a playlist or embed some of Jane's videos within an existing playlist on the Criminologist channel. Jane, thank you so much. Be well over there.
Thank you, Joe.
Okay. Bye-bye.
All the best. Bye now.
Wow, so much good stuff there. Thank you so much once again, Jane. Lots for all of us to reflect on and unpack. I will certainly be doing so moving forward as we continue to supervise our caseload of fictitious felons who thus far have benefited from an approach combining the risk-need-responsivity model with the great stuff we're learning about the Desistance approach to helping justice-involved individuals. And now, of course, we can add our newfound acumen around ACES and being even more trauma-informed to our holistic approach as to augmenting and advancing the client change process. You heard in the interview reference to a YouTube clip entitled Step Inside the Circle. That was the Fritzie Horseman documentary. I will leave a link to that in the episode description of the show you're listening to now. Also, post-interview offline, one of those was entitled A Neurodevelopmentally Aware, Trauma-Responsive Approach to Understanding Risk. And in that article, she argues that our understanding of risk and criminogenic need can be greatly enhanced by incorporating developments from neuroscience and the ACES, Adverse Childhood Experiences, studies that we talked about on the show. That is a great read. And then also one of her articles entitled Towards ACE-Aware, Trauma-Responsive Penal Policy and Practice, that was published in the Prison Service Journal. I'm going to try to get both of those in the description to this episode if I can figure out how to do that from a PDF. Otherwise, if you're interested in those articles, you can reach out to me. My email is thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. And we'll figure out a way to get those to you. I might play around and get those up on my website somewhere, somehow. We're going to get that information available to you. So yeah, another big thanks to Jane Mulcahy joining us all the way across the pond, as they say. Sorry, I just couldn't resist that. From Ireland. And I know we have some international listeners, but for you folks in the US of A, next week we will be back with a special Halloween episode. In the meantime, you can contact the show, as I mentioned, through our email, thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us on social media. We have a Facebook page and an Instagram page at The Criminologist Podcast. We're adding new fun images all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out on that. You can connect with me personally, Joseph Arvidsson, through my LinkedIn account. And The Criminologist Podcast, as well as the Paragon Group, also have LinkedIn pages that you may follow. And lastly, if you have not already done so, Subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for great additional content building on what you hear every week on this podcast. I've got various playlists set up on that podcast with Desistance from Crime playlist, an evidence-based practice playlist, an implementation science playlist, and then a fun little playlist where we do things related to the podcast. I also, as I mentioned in the interview, upload some of Jane's YouTube videos to our playlist. And as I mentioned, I have the works of other subject matter experts who have released YouTube videos on our channel as well, contained within our various playlists. So it's a great little hub if you want to do a deep dive on a lot of the themes that we cover here on this podcast. So please check that out. If you so desire, coffee mugs are available. Let us know and we can hook you up with one of those. And in the meantime, folks, remember, there's no them. There's only us.
The Criminologist podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, training opportunities, or to contact the host, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. Click on the Contact Us tab in the upper right-hand side of the page. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.
The thoughts, statements, and opinions of the host and cast members do not necessarily reflect the views of their employers and are those of the host and cast themselves. Any discussion regarding client statements, behaviors, actions, or crimes are purely fictional and are used only for the purposes of example. Any examples that could be deemed to be related to an actual individual or individuals are incidental.